On May 10, 1869, at a barren stretch of desert north of the Great Salt Lake, a single golden spike was driven into a railroad tie, and in that moment, a journey that had once taken settlers 4 to 6, punishing months by wagon train, was reduced to less than a week by rail. It's difficult, from where we sit today, to fully appreciate just how radical that transformation actually was. In a single decade, 2 competing companies, driven by fierce rivalry, staggering political corruption, and the backbreaking labor of tens of thousands of workers, had done something many contemporary engineers considered nearly impossible. They had laid nearly 1,800 miles of continuous track across deserts, mountain ranges, and open plains, connecting the American East to the American West for the very first time. This is the story of how it was built, the engineering feats it demanded, the human cost it exacted, and the corruption that financed it. The idea of a transcontinental railroad had circulated in American political discourse for decades before construction ever began, but it took the pressures of the Civil War itself to finally force the project into motion. With Southern congressmen no longer present to argue over competing sectional routes, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, authorizing 2 separate companies to build the line from opposite directions and meet somewhere in the middle. The Central Pacific Railroad would build eastward from Sacramento, California, pushing directly into the towering granite wall of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The Union Pacific Railroad would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska, across the plains, and eventually into the Rocky Mountains. Critically, the act structured the entire project as a race, since both companies received government land grants and bonds calculated per mile of track completed, meaning the faster either company built, the more land and money it received, an incentive structure that would drive both extraordinary engineering achievement and extraordinary financial corruption in roughly equal measure. The Central Pacific faced, by almost universal engineering assessment at the time, the more geographically brutal challenge of the 2. Its route required climbing from Sacramento, sitting at roughly 40 feet above sea level, to the summit of Donner Pass at over 7,000 feet, gaining the overwhelming majority of that elevation within just about 90 miles. This meant blasting directly through some of the hardest granite in North America, carving a rail bed along impossibly steep mountainsides, and constructing 11 separate tunnels through solid rock, 7 of them clustered within a single 3-mile stretch near the summit itself. The company's leadership, a group of Sacramento businessmen who came to be known as the Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, faced an immediate and serious labor shortage. California, in the early 1860s, was still gripped by its own gold and silver mining booms, and few able-bodied workers wanted backbreaking railroad labor when independent prospecting seemed to offer a faster path to fortune. Charles Crocker, overseeing construction, made a decision that his own business partners initially resisted, proposing that the company recruit Chinese immigrant laborers already present in California in modest numbers, and eventually recruit additional workers directly from southern China itself. That decision would prove absolutely decisive to the entire project's success. By the railroad's completion, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese laborers had worked for the Central Pacific, eventually making up roughly 90% of its entire workforce, a staggering statistic that placed the overwhelming majority of the most dangerous and physically demanding labor in American railroad history onto the shoulders of immigrant workers who received strikingly little credit for it at the time. The conditions these workers faced were genuinely extraordinary, both in the scale of what they accomplished and in the danger they were routinely exposed to. Chinese laborers were paid roughly $30 a month, itself a reasonably competitive wage for the era. But unlike their white counterparts, they were required to provide and pay for their own food and lodging out of that same wage. a disparity that meaningfully reduced their effective earnings compared to workers doing identical labor beside them. At the most demanding stretches of mountain construction, workers were lowered in hand-woven baskets down sheer granite cliff faces to drill holes and place explosive charges, working suspended hundreds of feet above the valley floor to carve a rail bed into rock walls that offered no other means of access at all. Winter in the High Sierra brought some of the heaviest snowfall recorded anywhere in the United States, and workers spent entire seasons laboring inside snow tunnels, dug simply to allow continued excavation of the rock tunnels underneath. An almost unimaginable double burden of engineering against both mountain and climate simultaneously. Avalanches were a constant, deadly hazard, and while precise casualty figures from the period remain incomplete and disputed among historians, credible estimates suggest that well over 1,000 Chinese laborers died during the railroad's construction, from avalanches, explosions, disease, and the sheer physical toll of the work itself. The engineering challenge of the Summit Tunnel, cutting through 1,659 feet of solid granite near the crest of Donner Pass, illustrates just how methodical and innovative this construction effort had to become. Rather than working from only two ends, engineers sank a vertical shaft 125 feet down to the tunnel's midpoint, allowing crews to work simultaneously on 4 separate rock faces at once, doubling the pace of an excavation that would otherwise have taken considerably longer. Progress in the hardest granite sections sometimes amounted to less than a foot of tunnel per day, achieved through the grueling, repetitive cycle of drilling holes by hand, packing them with black powder, detonating the charge, and clearing the shattered rock before beginning the entire process again. By 1867, the Central Pacific had begun experimenting with nitroglycerin, a considerably more powerful and considerably more unstable and dangerous explosive than the black powder used previously. Mixed on site by a chemist the company hired specifically for the purpose, since transporting the volatile compound any real distance was considered too dangerous to attempt. The Union Pacific, building westward from Omaha, faced a different but equally demanding set of challenges. Its early route across the Great Plains allowed for remarkably fast track laying once crews and material supply lines were established, since the terrain itself required comparatively little blasting or excavation. But this speed came with its own considerable dangers. Union Pacific work crews, composed largely of Irish immigrants, alongside a substantial number of Civil War veterans from both the Union and Confederate armies, and later joined by Mormon laborers as the line approached Utah, faced recurring conflict with Native American nations, whose lands and traditional hunting grounds the railroad was cutting directly through, disrupting bison migration patterns and encroaching on territory that had been the subject of recent treaties. As the Union Pacific pushed further west into Wyoming and eventually into the mountainous terrain approaching Utah, its own engineering challenges intensified considerably, requiring substantial bridge construction, including the massive Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming, at the time one of the tallest railroad bridges ever constructed in the United States. We break down the engineering systems, human labor, and political forces that forged the modern world, preserving the facts and lessons of our past before they are lost to time. Subscribe today to help us preserve these deep historical insights and join our community of dedicated enthusiasts. Behind both companies' visible engineering achievements lay a far less visible and considerably less admirable financial architecture. Because federal subsidies were paid per mile of track completed, both companies had enormous incentive to maximize construction costs charged against those government payments, a dynamic the Union Pacific exploited through a financial vehicle called Credit Mobilier of America, a construction company that Union Pacific insiders themselves owned and controlled. Credit Mobilier billed the Union Pacific grossly inflated rates for construction work, and since the same men sat on both sides of these transactions, as Union Pacific executives and as Crédit Mobilier shareholders. The arrangement allowed insiders to siphon enormous profits directly out of what was ostensibly a public infrastructure project, funded substantially by government bonds and land grants. When the scheme was finally exposed publicly in 1872, it implicated numerous sitting members of Congress who had reportedly received discounted Crédit Mobilier stock in exchange for favorable treatment of Union Pacific legislation, producing one of the largest political corruption scandals of the entire 19th century, and permanently attaching the Crédit Mobilier name to American political vocabulary as shorthand for exactly this kind of self-dealing insider corruption. As both lines pushed deeper into Utah territory in early 1869, competitive tensions between the two companies reached an almost absurd extreme. With no fixed meeting point specified in the original legislation, and both companies continuing to receive government payment for every mile graded, construction crews for a period actually built parallel, overlapping grades running past each other in the same general territory, each company racing to claim government subsidy for the same stretch of ground the other had already begun grading. The dispute grew serious enough that President Ulysses S. Grant, recently inaugurated, intervened directly in March of 1869, informing both companies that federal funding would be withheld entirely until their leadership formally agreed on a single meeting point. The two companies settled on Promontory Summit, Utah, a location roughly 690 miles from Sacramento and 1,086 miles from Omaha. Even the final ceremony itself, now remembered as one of American history's iconic moments, was delayed several times by circumstances considerably less romantic than the occasion demands. The ceremony, originally scheduled for May 8th, had to be postponed after Union Pacific workers, owed significant back wages, temporarily halted a train carrying company officials until payment was arranged. A small, telling reminder that even at the very culmination of this historic achievement, the laborers who had actually built the railroad were still fighting simply to be paid what they were owed. When the ceremony finally proceeded on May 10, 1869, Central Pacific President Leland Stanford was given the honor of driving the final spike, a ceremonial spike made of 17.6 karat gold, donated by a San Francisco contractor and friend of Stanford's specifically for the occasion. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Stanford's first symbolic swing missed the spike entirely, striking only the wooden tie beneath it, an anticlimactic moment that nonetheless did nothing to diminish the genuine significance of what the two companies had accomplished. That significance deserves to be stated plainly. In just over 6 years of active construction, two competing companies had built nearly 1,800 miles of continuous railroad across some of the most challenging terrain in North America, using largely manual labor, black powder and experimental nitroglycerin, hand tools, and animal-drawn equipment, decades before the arrival of modern heavy construction machinery. It remains, by almost any reasonable measure, one of the most significant engineering achievements in 19th century American history, one that permanently transformed the nation's economy, its westward settlement patterns, and its sense of its own geographic unity, cutting a journey that had once taken the better part of a year down to less than a single week. And yet, the completion ceremony itself carried a telling and uncomfortable omission. Though Chinese laborers had made up the overwhelming majority of the Central Pacific's workforce and had performed much of the most dangerous and technically demanding work of the entire project, official photographs taken at Promontory Summit that day featured almost none of them, an absence historians have since come to recognize as a deliberate erasure of exactly the workers whose labor had made the achievement physically possible in the first place. It would take well over a century and a considerable amount of dedicated historical research before the full scale of the Chinese laborers' contribution and their staggering human cost received the recognition and remembrance it had always genuinely deserved. The railroad's completion did not, of course, mark the end of the story for the men and companies involved. The Credit Mobilier scandal would continue unfolding publicly for years afterward, ultimately touching the vice presidency of the United States itself and permanently damaging the reputations of numerous prominent political figures. The Union Pacific, financially overextended and entangled in scandal, would face a severe reorganization following the financial crisis of 1873. But the physical achievement itself endured regardless of the corruption that had financed portions of it. A permanent steel connection between two coasts that had, until that spring morning in 1869, remained separated by months of dangerous, exhausting travel. Which aspect of the Transcontinental Railroad's construction surprised you the most? Share this video with a fellow history buff and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.